Today's lesson is the croissant, a French pastry with Austrian roots. Hello, everyone. I'm Mike.
I am Roger, and today we're going to be talking about the croissant again. And again, these are those crescent-shaped pastries that we think came from France, but they actually came from Austria, or at least they were made by an Austrian entrepreneur who was living in Paris at the time. And, of course, we all love them. They're so tasty. I think you can buy them at some of the more fancy bakeries in Taipei, but I don't really see them at the neighborhood bakeries so much. I think that's because it requires a complex process to bake them, and not all bakeries are willing to put the time and effort into making croissants.
That's a very good point. They are sort of labor-intensive and do also require a lot of certain ingredients. We're going to get into how you actually make the croissant, and I think a lot of us will be surprised at kind of how complicated and intricate it can be. I think some of these pastries, too, the humidity in Taiwan doesn't always help them. You know, you get the croissants, and by the time you get them home, they're not so flaky anymore. They've picked up some of the moisture from the air. I know French baguettes, similar. They become quite chewy very quickly when the air is very humid. That may also have something to do with it. But if you want to, I'm sure you can make up a nice batch of croissants in your own kitchen if you don't want to go and buy them at a local bakery. And if you are into DIY or do-it-yourself croissants, well, don't go anywhere because we have a recipe coming up right now with also the techniques in how to make it all come out very, very beautifully. So let's check it out.
Making croissants is a complex process that takes time and skill, with the pastry's main ingredients being flour, yeast, sugar, salt, milk, and butter. The key to a good croissant is creating many thin layers of dough and butter, which give the pastry its light and flaky texture. During this layering process, the dough is rolled out, butter is spread on top, and then the dough is folded again and again. This process is repeated several times, and this repetition creates many layers. The dough is then cut into triangles, rolled into the croissant shape, and left to rise. Finally, the croissants are baked until crispy.
大家好，第一部分介绍名词 ingredient， 它的意思是食材或是材料。例如 I only use the freshest ingredients in my cooking. 我在料理时只使用最新鲜的食材。或者 The restaurant only used the most expensive ingredients in its dishes. 这间餐厅只用最昂贵的食材来制作料理。接着看到这个名词 yeast， 表示酵母或是酵母菌。例如 Without yeast, bread will not rise. 没有酵母，面包就不会发酵。或是I mixed yeast with a cup of warm milk before adding it to the flour to make bread. 我把酵母和一杯温牛奶混合，然后加入面粉制作面包。后面看到名词 dough， 表示生面团。例如 I shaped the dough into the form of a star before I baked it. 在烘烤之前，我将面团捏成星星的形状。也可以说 Misty bought some flour to make pizza dough. Misty 买了一些面粉来做披萨面团。下一个介绍名词 texture， 表示口感，也可以是质地或是质感的意思。我们可以说 Fuji apples are known for having a crisp, crunchy texture. 富士苹果以清脆的口感著称。又或者说 The texture of the fabric was soft and smooth, perfect for a dress. 这块布料的质地柔软光滑，非常适合做裙子。再来看到名词 repetition，意思是重复或是反复发生。例如 Through constant repetition, Carla memorized the entire poem. 透过经常反复练习 Carla 背下了那一整首诗。再看一个例子 Repetition is the only way to get better at certain skills. 重复是提高某些技能的唯一方法。
Okay, let's talk about how croissants are made or baked. Remember, this is a kind of food that is baked. You don't fry it or deep fry it or stir fry it
that
or
could
whatever.
be a new taste sensation.
Yeah, you could try it, actually.
Deep-fried croissants.
Might be quite crispy, crunchy that way. But making croissants is a complex process. Okay, complex just means complicated. It involves lots of different steps. And it takes time and skill that you'll have to learn, with the pastry's main ingredients being being flour, yeast, sugar, salt, milk, and butter. So those are the ingredients, the different things that you need to prepare something. Oftentimes when you look at a recipe, it will make a list, or it will have a list of all the ingredients that you need. If you want to make a hamburger, for example, the ingredients would be beef and buns. Basically, that's all you need. And maybe some cheese and tomatoes and onions or whatever. Those would be the ingredients. And again, those ingredients include flour, yeast, sugar, salt, milk, and butter. Now, yeast here is kind of complicated. I got a definition for it. It says it's a microscopic fungus consisting of single oval cells. Brrr, who could remember that? So I'm just going to tell you the Chinese. It's xiaomu in Chinese. And yes, indeed, that is an ingredient that you need to have if you bake things. I think yeast is pretty much needed for all sorts of baked pastries.
Yeah, basically it gets your bread to rise. Yeast, of course, floats around in the air naturally, but also you can buy yeast and that can speed up the process. But you'll often see people, making the flour and then they kind of leave it to sit there for a few hours. That's the yeast working on it. And of course, yeast is also very important in making alcohol. So making wine or beer, yeast goes to work on the sugars inside the grape juice, for example, turning it into alcohol. It says the key to a good croissant. All right, pay attention here, folks. The key to a good croissant is creating many thin layers of dough and butter, which give the pastry its light and flaky texture. Yeah, it's kind of like making a Japanese samurai sword. You have to keep folding the material back and forth over top, making these very, very thin layers. And you're doing that, of course, using dough, which is the raw material used to make almost any baked good, from bread to a pie crust. Dough is basically a very thick substance made up of flour and liquid, and it's very thick, and it can be sort of formed and pushed and molded and beaten with your hands. So that's what you'll do with the dough. You'll kind of work oxygen into it, get the yeast working in there. So the dough is kind of the uncooked material that will go into the bread when eventually it is cooked or baked in an oven. But dough is what you start off with. So you have the dough, you have a lot of butter, and this gives the pastry its light and flaky texture. Texture is a good word to use when describing foods. It's the feel of the food in your mouth. In fact, some people will just say the word mouthfeel, but what they mean is texture. So if you're eating potato chips, they have a dry and crunchy texture. If you're eating something like tofu, it has a very soft texture. Certain foods might not be appealing to certain groups of people. That famous Japanese food, natto, is kind of a weird texture, especially for Westerners.
Kind of a slimy texture.
Kind of a slimy texture. Maybe owajin, the oyster omelet that you get in the night market, that could also be a slightly unusual texture. But it's basically how it feels on your teeth and your tongue and inside your mouth. And of course, croissants have this nice light and flaky texture, and that is all created through layering these different layers of dough. So how do we actually do the layering?
During this layering process, the dough is rolled out, butter is spread on top, and then the dough is folded again and again. Like you were describing the samurai sword, you fold it over again and again, like if you take a piece of paper and fold it in half. Gee, how many times can you fold a piece of paper? Maybe 5 or 6 times before you can't do it anymore. 7? Okay.
I think so.
Sounds right. And yes, you roll out the dough. So you take the dough, you make it into little balls or whatever, and you put it on the surface, the counter. Maybe you have some flour spread out so it's softer or smoother that way. And then you take probably a rolling pin, and then you push down on the dough. You go back and forth, left and right. You go in all directions to make it nice and round. You'll probably do that if you're making skins for dumplings or something like that. You'll roll out the dough, usually using some kind of rolling pin or something. And that's what you do with the dough to make croissants. You roll out the dough, and then you spread the butter on top of what you just rolled out, and then the dough is folded over again and again. That's part of the process.
And this process is repeated several times, and this repetition creates many layers. As Roger was saying, you do it again and again, fold it over on top of itself, kind of making very thin dough and butter sandwiches as you kind of go on and on and on, different layers of this. And that's what you're doing when you're doing repetition. You're doing something again and again. You're doing something again and again. You see the repetition there? I'm saying something over and over again. If you go to the gym, you might be told you should do 10 reps with this weight. Lift this weight 10 times. That's 10 repetitions. Do it 10 times again and again.
Could you repeat that, please?
I could say I could do it 10 times again and again. And the idea, of course, is also that you're doing it in a very similar way. way again and again. You're basically copying yourself over and over. That's repetition. The dough is then cut into triangles, rolled into the croissant shape, and left to rise. This is the only part of making croissants I've ever done when I was a kid, and maybe even now at Costco or something. You can buy sort of the dough in a tube, and you take it home and you cut it or peel it off. And then as kids, it's actually kind of fun for kids, you roll them into these sort of just rolls and then twist the ends to make that crescent shape. And hey, I made croissants. Well, yeah, but you skipped all the hard part and you just did the rolling out and the shaping part. But that's basically what you end up with. So you roll out these and then shape them into the croissant shape and then leave them to rise. That's, again, when the yeast and the oxygen inside the dough is causing it to actually expand or to rise, to get bigger. And then finally, the croissants are baked until crispy. Toss them in an oven for probably not too long. I would say 10 to 15 minutes probably at the most. And bake them until they're crispy. If something's crispy, it's dried out. It's a little bit crunchy. If you're looking at the outside of it, it's probably a nice golden brown kind of color like the crispy skin on your chicken or something like that. And that shows you, along with the smell in the air, that your croissants are ready to enjoy.
Right, so you need to let the dough rise first before you put it in the oven to bake it. I hate to say this, but this description of baking croissants is actually making me hungry for sun cakes down in Taichung there. I'd really like to go down there and try some, and I'd like to know exactly how those are prepared. I'm sure they're probably prepared in a similar manner.
What if you could do a sun croissant?
Yeah, kind of a mixture of the two.
Them.
Yeah, kind of a hybrid.
They did a cronut that was popular, right, in New York, the croissant donut.
I'm not from New York, I don't know, but
yeah, it was a trendy food a few years ago.
But in any case, yes, that's basically the baking process for the croissants, just in case you wanted to know. And now we're going to talk about different kinds of croissants in our next paragraph. Let's listen.
There are many croissant variations. One is the pain au chocolat, which contains chocolate. Another is the almond croissant, which is filled with sweet almond paste and topped with sliced almonds. There are plenty of savory versions too. For example, croissants often stand in for sandwich bread these days, which means that fillings such as ham and smoked salmon have become popular.
第二部分看到形容词 savory， 它表示咸的、香辣的，也可以是美味可口的。可以说 These rice dumplings have an incredibly savory flavor. 这些粽子非常咸香美味。也可以说 The hostess set out several savory snacks for her guests. 女主人端出多道可口点心招待客人。最后看到 version 这个单字，它是名词，指的是版本。举例来说 I have an older version of that game, so it probably won't run on your computer. 我的游戏是旧版的，所以它可能没办法在你的电脑上玩。或者 Sam's version of the story of the breakup is nothing like Amy's. Sam 说的分手缘由和 Amy 的版本大相径庭。
All right, we are back with more croissants. And now that we know the basics on how to make the traditional croissant in kind of the French way, using lots of dough and butter to create a very light and flaky kind of dish, or a light and flaky kind of bread dessert or treat, let's find out about some different croissant variations. Because, of course, once you've filled up on 24 croissants in one day, you're gonna get bored. So you need some options, right? It says there are many croissant variations. By the way, don't eat 24 croissants in one day. That would just not be good for you.
No good.
Not good at all. There are many croissant variations. So yes, with most foods today, you can find varieties. People add in different ingredients. They give you fruit flavors or chocolate flavors, or well, let's put in some peanut butter in there and see what it's like. These are variations, right? When you're taking something and we're making different varieties, different flavors, different styles of it. A lot of people love pizza because pizza, of course, comes with endless variations. Whatever you can think of, you can put on it, and it will be a whole new pizza with a whole new flavor in case you're bored with traditional pizza. It says one is the pain au chocolat, which contains chocolate. Yes, absolutely. It means bread of chocolate in French. I didn't know it's a croissant because it's got a slightly different, more of a bun type shape to it. But yes, the pastry is very, very similar. It's nice and flaky and buttery, but pain au chocolat just has kind of a nice stick of chocolate chocolate in it, surrounded by that lovely flaky croissant dough. Another is the almond croissant, which is filled with sweet almond paste and topped with sliced almonds. Both of these are pretty common and I think traditional variations on the croissant. Certainly not something new and hip that was only discovered on Instagram. The pain au chocolat or the almond croissant, two great classics that are a little bit of a spin or a little twist on the classic croissant. What else do they have?
Well, they don't only have sweet ones. We also have savory versions, so there are plenty of savory versions as well. Savory means they're kind of spicy or salty. They're not so sweet. And for example, croissants often stand in for sandwich bread these days, which means that fillings such as ham and smoked salmon have become popular. So you can have sort of a croissant sandwich, but of course they can't be too sweet, so they need to be savory. These are different versions or different kinds of croissants, and they stand in or they substitute for sandwich bread. Okay, so if you're bored of having that plain old white bread with your sandwich, try a sandwich made with croissant buns. And in this particular case, the fillings or the things inside of the sandwich will be ham and smoked salmon and other things. These are quite popular. Salmon, of course, is that fish that's kind of pink and orange in color.
Absolutely. Yeah, those could be very delicious if you're looking for a different thing for your lunchtime sandwich. And of course, when we talk about these fillings, these are just some examples. You could have cheese, you could have just tomato and salt or something like that. So a lot of these are really up to you as well. A lot of different variations there. All right, so let's move on to the final paragraph. We're going to be looking at some of the newest and hippest versions of the croissant.
Even now, the humble croissant is still evolving, with bakers creating variations like cronuts, which are basically donuts made with croissant dough. But however they evolve, it's clear that croissants will remain a beloved treat, not only in France, but around the world.
Okay, so even now in modern times, we still have different variations in the croissant. The humble croissant is still evolving. Okay, it's the humble croissant. It's the basic one, but it's still changing over time with bakers creating variations like cronuts.
There you go.
Which are basically donuts made with croissant dough. Okay, I don't think I've ever heard of that, but you make donuts using croissant dough, so it probably gives you a special kind of texture when police officers stop in and have donuts at their local Dunkin' Donuts.
That's what the French police, I guess, eat, the cronut, because they are police, but they are French. So these started off in New York. I remember a few years ago, there were people, lining up for 2 hours to get a bag of cronuts because they were so hip and cool. But I think now you can probably find them sold in many different cities. Go to a bakery downtown where they might have some of these very novel and unique things. Get yourself a cronut. Try that out. But however they evolve, it says it's clear that croissants will remain a beloved treat, not only in France, but around the world. That's true. You can jazz them up in all sorts of ways, come out with all sorts of new and exciting variations, but the classic food, in this case, the classic croissant, will still always, for many people, be the best, and that will be the one that a lot of us will come back to after we've eaten our fill of cronuts and other popular variations. The classic one will never let you down. It's a beloved treat. If something is beloved or beloved, it means it's much loved and respected, probably over a long period of time, maybe by different generations of people. They've all sort of fallen in love with this thing or really discovered the magic of this thing. We could talk about an elderly relative as being beloved, right? They've had many grandkids and great-grandkids, and everyone loves them, and we all celebrate their birthday. And also cultural institutions, certain icons, certain stars might be described as beloved, or a place that people go to that has a special certain meaning in their lives. That could also be beloved. It's just basically loved and respected. And so croissants are beloved not only in France, but around the world. I'm sure right here in Taiwan, we could find lots of people who would love to spend their day eating as many croissants as possible.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our lesson for today. It's time now to hear from Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第3部分的最后一句提到 But however they evolve, it's clear that croissants will remain a beloved treat not only in France, but around the world. 但无论他们怎么发展，显然可颂将仍然是深受人们喜爱的点心，不仅是在法国，在世界各地也是如此。那这边有几个重点，第一个是 however 在这边是相当于 no matter how， 表达无论如何。那么 no matter 之后接了 WH 疑问词，像 what, who, when, where, how 等等，就可以引导让步副词子句去表达无论什么什么都怎么样，或者是不管怎么样还是点点点。那这就可以改写成 WH 疑问词后面再加上 EVER。举例来说 Sweet potatoes are delicious however you cook them。也可以说 Sweet potatoes are delicious no matter how you cook them。地瓜不管怎么煮都很好吃。好，那另外 no matter how 之后还可以接形容词或副词，也就是形成 no matter how 形容词或副词加主词加动词这样的句型，表示无论有多么怎么样。那也可以改写成 however 形容词或副词加主词加动词。例如 No matter how good you are at something, there's always room for improvement。那也可以说 however good you are at something,There's always room for improvement。 不论你有多么擅长某件事，永远都有进步的空间。那第二个重点是 remain， 当连缀动词它可以表达保持，仍旧还是怎么样怎么样，后面可以接名词或形容词来当补语去说明状态。像文中是在 remain 后面接名词 a beloved treat 去表达仍然是深受人们喜爱的点心。我们也造两个例句 Please remain silent,During the show， 在表演过程中，请保持安静。The cause of his death remains a mystery。他的死因仍然是个谜。好，那么第三个重点是文中他用到 not only in France but around the world， 这个 but 后面省略了 also。那我们来复习一下 not only but also 的用法。那它是表达说不止怎么样还怎么样，不仅怎么样而且怎么样。那它是配对连接词，必须用来连接两个词性相同的字词。连接动词的时候呢，时态必须一致。例如He not only paints, but also writes poems. 他不但会画画，还会写诗。那这边就是连接了两个现在式动词。那如果用来连接两个主词的话，动词就必须配合最靠近它的主词。像 Not only the dining table, but also the chairs need to be replaced. 不只是餐桌，还有椅子都需要换掉。那我们的动词 need 是配合最靠近它的主词 the chairs， 所以是用 need 复数动词，而不是用 needs 单数动词。好，那么以上今天重点整理，我们回顾这些单字吧。
Ingredient. Hector checked the list of ingredients to see if the dish contained any nuts. Dough. Bonnie rolled the dough for the pizza into a flat circle. Texture. Christopher loves the crunchy texture of fresh vegetables in the salad. Repetition. The teacher used repetition to help the students remember the words. Variation. Each region of the country has its own variation of this classic dessert. Version. The movie is an updated version of a classic tale from the 1960s. Salmon. Wild salmon is known for its rich flavor and bright color. Beloved. Dr. Harkness dedicated his book to his beloved parents.
Discussion Starter starts now!
Here's our discussion starter for today. The question is, which croissant variation is your favorite? Or which type would you most like to try?
My favorite type of croissant is the raspberry croissant at a bakery here in Taipei. I like it because it was very sweet and delicious and tasty, and I'm sad because they discontinued it a few weeks ago.
Oh no!
We went to buy some, and they said, nope, we don't have those anymore. And we said, why not? And they said, not enough people bought them. And we said, people are crazy. And then we cried.
Supply and demand.
Yeah.
That's something in economics there. But my favorite type of croissant is the plain one. I hate to sound boring, but yeah, like you said, you could always put different kinds of jam on the croissant. And of course, I think it's a compliment to things like coffee or tea or whatever. Yeah, if they start getting too weird with those different variations, I kind of think, I don't want that. I just want it plain and simple. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I am Mike.
See you next time.